Thank you, Kerry, for the introduction and also Keith for your invitation to join you. For those who know a lot about Timor Leste, bear with us for a few moments because I thought what I would do to talk about what we're doing in Timor Leste to do with mortality, morbidity, childbirth is really obviously the scene of where they're coming from. And to talk a little bit, a very happy topic, I'm afraid, maternal mortality, death, to give that background, so bear with me. For those of you who aren't familiar with Timor Leste, and I must admit before I started going up there, I knew it was up there somewhere, and you flew over it sometimes if you're going to Europe. Obviously, Timor Leste, East Timor is the eastern end of the island. On the west was West Timor, which is obviously an Indonesian island. I can point Dili, which is the capital, is on the northern side. Most of the population is on the north. The second largest town is Macau. Not a great deal of distance, but until recently about a 3-hour trip, if you were lucky, to go about 120 k's. Roads have improved. Now, I will come back and talk a little bit more about the places where we've been working. So, a potted history of Timor-Leste. 3 waves of migration. Around 40,000 BC, the Australoids related to the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander group, the Austronesians, the Melanesian group, and then the Proto-Malays after that. In the 1300s, the Chinese and Indians set up training networks, as from my reference, basically in sandalwood, in slaves, honey and wax, but not necessarily in that order. Then in the 1500s, the European explorers started coming out, the Portuguese, the Dutch particularly, and particularly the attraction was sandalwood. In 1769, Portugal declared the colony of Portugal, Timor, and Dili was founded. The Portuguese actually didn't leave a great deal. Some lovely old buildings, this is the marketplace in Macau, did very little with roads, very little with infrastructure. They mostly, as they say, raped and pillaged Timor and took most of the resources back to Portugal. In 1914, the border between Dutch West Timor and Portuguese East Timor was defined. Then in 42 to 45, the Japanese occupation, there was the guerrilla campaign, the remnants of the Sparrow Force, the Tutu independent company, fought a guerrilla war for about 2 years, and they say tied up a lot of Japanese troops. The downside of it was that between 40 and 70,000 East Timorese were murdered in reprisal for helping Australia. I think, you know, as we talk, thank you, that we owe Timor a lot. In 1945, with the overthrow, with the Japanese leaving, Portuguese control was re-established, and again for the next really 29 years, not a lot was done to develop East Timor. It's really a bit more of the same. Then there was the Portuguese rebellion, and East Timor was abandoned. There was the move for independence, but there was a civil war between Fretilin and UDT, who really were anti-independence and pro-Indonesia. Briefly, on the 28th of November, there was a declaration of independence. Then, December 75, the Indonesian invasion, which I think most people here would be very familiar with Balaboa. US and Australia turned an absolute blind eye because it's over oil and the Timor Gap, and again, it really started one of the bloodiest periods, I think, anywhere in the 20th century. By the 17th of July, the East Timor was declared the 27th province of Indonesia, called Timor, or Timur. Between 75 and 99, during the Indonesian occupation, Indonesian language became the language in which taught, became the business language. Yes, they did put in a lot of more infrastructure, roads were built, hospitals were built, schools were built, but at an awful cost. It's been estimated 18,500 were actually killed. There are 84,000 excess deaths being calculated from hunger and disease. And a lot were removed to West Timor and Indonesia. So they say about 250,000, almost a quarter of the population, were either died or were displaced. And that's had a big, big influence, because it really took out what would now be the middle management age group, just disappeared. And that's, yes. Then in 1991, really the turning point for the West could no longer, which was the Santa Cruz massacre. And again, I presume that most people are well familiar with it. This is the pathway coming in from the gateway to Santa Cruz Cemetery. And I put actually up on the next slide, which was that, that little chapel was where the filming of the massacre was done by Max Stahl, and it is up on YouTube. Actually, it's very solitary to watch it again. I had the privilege of getting to meet Max Stahl and talk a bit about his partner in a moment, who's our paediatrician up there. But what they did, he filmed it. They happened to be there. They knew something was brewing. He then, it was on cassettes, buried it in the ground under his feet, and when the Indonesians captured him and took him off to their headquarters, he kept one film which he gave them, and said the chilling thing was it identified them, and they were so proud. These ones who had just, at that point, they had only shot about 50. And when later he went back at midnight, because they knew they were deaths, they didn't like to go to the cemetery, he was able to rescue the film cassettes, divided them up, sent one to Australia, where the Australian government tried to confiscate its pornography. Another was smuggled out to Japan, another to Portugal. And from that was that realisation with the publicity of what really was going on, and that really turned the tide. The East Timor Solidarity Movement grew up Portugal and Australia. In August 99, Suharto was forced to resign. There was a supervised referendum where they did not expect that the Timor Leste would vote for independence, and much to their surprise, it was an overwhelming move. Then there was the punitive campaign for killing, an enormous amount of destruction by the by the ET and the pro-integration militia, and that of course is when the UN Peace Force came in with Australia leading from their Governor General, and the UN took over administrative control. 85% of the houses lost their roofs. So the destruction from that, and I think Square Rotary, I must say, I think is a very proud record there. They set up the East Timor Roofing Company and got roofing iron in Bucau and training from that point. But that was a typical scene. You can still see the remnants of it around. So in 2002, there was formal independence with Giordano Gusmao being the first president. There was a series of disturbances. In 2006, the UN troops had to come back to restore order. 15% of the population lived at home. There was the attempted assassination of Ramos Horta, who of course was evacuated out to Darwin, to the Royal Darwin Hospital. The East Team peacekeeping role ended on the 31st of December, and of course the ongoing East Timor oil and gas dispute. I read an interesting briefing paper where the DFAT said it's all well under control, but it did put in small print. That's not necessarily the opinion held by East Timor, so renegotiating. Okay, so that's the background of East Timor. What I'll just talk a little bit now about maternal mortality, and I'm sorry, it's not a very happy topic over lunch, is it? By definition, it's the death of a woman while pregnant, so any time up to 42 days after the end of the pregnancy from any cause, but not including accidental, where a person may, for example, have died in a car accident, or incidental causes not related to pregnancy. And so we have the direct causes where it's due to the obstetric complications, so bleeding, infection, things like that, high blood pressure, or indirect where there are pre-existing diseases like heart disease, which is aggravated by pregnancy. Now, the impact of maternal mortality: every minute a woman dies in childbirth. So if I talk to you, I've got a 2.5-hour talk, so by the end of that, that's 150 women would have died during my talk.
Where is that?
That's worldwide. Okay. So every year, 340,000. But it's the other part of it, the 10 million that suffer debilitating illnesses and lifelong disability that comes from that. And the impact is, of course, not just obviously on the mother, but the impact on the family. Children under 10 whose mothers die in childbirth are 3 to 10 times more likely themselves to die within 2 years of birth, the central role of the caregiver. They're less likely to enrol in school or have to leave school to support their family. They're less likely to have prevention like immunisation, malnourishment, and it's particularly worse for girls. Economic impact: this was figures from about 5 years ago, estimated $15.5 billion in potential productivity loss. So the loss, maternal mortality, okay, is the most extreme bad outcome associated with pregnancy, but it's got a huge, huge impact. Just looking at comparison and what's been happening with maternal mortality ratios. So this is the number of women dying per 100,000 live births. And you can see from 1990 down to 2013, yes, there's been a marked reduction. In Timor Leste was 1,200. It's estimated to be down around 300 now. Indonesia and the one next to it, much less, but still, as we'll see in a moment, high. India, Papua New Guinea, which is actually increasing, not decreasing. And then Australia, we can just see Australia down the bottom here, and US. And I'll just enlarge on that. And so Australia is actually one of the safest places. So we run around 7 per 100,000. And we're running fairly straight line. US actually is probably twice as dangerous place to give birth in as Australia. It's an interesting mixture, of course, those who are familiar with the US. It's a mixture of a third world country and a first world country. That's assuming, of course, that people can count. Yes. We have enough trouble in Australia counting maternal, getting reporting. I'm confident, not just because I chair the committee in Victoria, we have actually, I think, one of the best collection systems. But it's interesting when you start looking, because where they aren't picking up are the early deaths. That we just don't know. The way they estimated, one estimate of deaths in Timor Leste was they went around and talked to the priests, who have you buried in the last year who's had a baby or was pregnant, and did it that way. Another way is to go around the graveyards and look at the date of birth, death of the child and the mother, who's often buried next to them. So although these figures come up and they're carved on stone, I think one can be a little bit, if anything, I'm sure they're an underestimate. So what's the lifetime risk of maternal death? Well, in industrialized countries, 4,300 women, one will die in her lifetime from maternal pregnancy-related causes. Developing countries, 120, and least developed countries, like Timor Leste, 37, 1 in 37. Now, just comparing other outcomes, or going through between the UNICEF health outcomes for Australia and Timor Leste, those who remember the figures, They're actually reporting a slightly lower figure for Australia, but it's this old problem. We would say that really should be around 6 to 8, but we'll take the 4. But in comparison, Timor Leste, 380 to 660. Lifetime risk of maternal death, 1 in 13,000 in Australia, 1 in 35 in Timor Leste. Under 5 mortality, 0.6, 0.5, 0.3. So infant mortality is deaths in the first year of life. Neonatal mortality is in the first 28 days of life. And you can see, and all of those, 18 times, 15 times, I need my calculator, about 9 times, 10 times. So in all of those, the chances of a child surviving his mother is dramatically less. Life expectancy at birth, 82, 61 in Timor Leste. But on the positive side, their immunisation, really very little different from Australia, 94 to 88, 85%, so moving. The antenatal coverage, that's the number of visits during pregnancy. We like to see at least 4, and in most places in Australia it would be 8 to 10, but at least for 100%, and a skilled birth attendant being at the birth 100% in Australia. 30 and 18. Most of the births in Timor-Leste are in the village with birth attendants with varying degrees of skills, and that's obviously one of the areas that we're working on. So what is effective in reducing maternal mortality? Well, obviously, great access to increasing numbers of skilled healthcare workers, and this is what's driving the program that we've been working with. So a 10% increase in that results in a 5% reduction in maternal mortality. It's a very big change for a very small, or relatively small move. But obviously better hospital services, family planning, family planning, family planning, family planning. Okay, the big driver. And of course, as economic conditions improve and increase, that's one of the biggest drivers to family planning. Part of the dilemma in Timor-Leste is an extremely strong church that has made it very difficult. That's changing, I understand, from those working out the field, but it isn't a big issue. But aid for family planning, 8.2 to 3.2, and I did that slide before. Australia's generous overseas aid. I'll say no more. It's, next one a week at times. And obviously increasing the numbers of antenatal visits. All of these things are effective tools in reducing, not only, we're concentrating on maternal mortality because that's much easier to measure. We're not talking about severe maternal morbidity, that's illness and after effects. Somebody who, for example, has had a high blood pressure and had a stroke, which yes, they'll survive, but then obviously it's got big implications. Or somebody's had major infection related to pregnancy, which leads to long-term infertility or pelvic problems. So we're not talking about that, but that obviously is a very important part of it as well. Okay, we've talked doom and gloom, but it's a beautiful place. This is looking back towards Dili on the north coast. Okay, so the current situation in Timor-Leste, there's been a rapid expansion of the training of health professionals, positive. The challenges are that the doctors now are going to Cuba for training. Cuba is one of the biggest healthcare training places in the world. It's one of the major sources of income. And there be a dilemma. The languages in Timor-Leste, the lingua franca is Tatum. That's where most speak. There are a lot of other languages. That's the most widely used one. Portuguese is now the official language. It's become the official. Those that survived the Indonesian time, the midwives, those who went off to train in, and the older doctors, Indonesian. But the ones who are going to Cuba, of course, it's Spanish speaking. So they go off for a year and do a Spanish speaking, didn't speak Spanish. And when they come back, of course, nobody speaks Spanish apart from the Cuban. The Cubans have got quite a few doctors who are working in Timor Leste. Again, that's a major source of income for Cuba because half of their salary, their pay, goes back to the Cuban government. So it's makes it complex. In schools, Tatum is and Portuguese are the two languages that they're taught in, and of course the plea is for English, but it's not, for various reasons, is not so high on the list. One of the other big issues, and again which drove our planning, is the access. The Dili is very much a centre. There's the university is there, the health sciences is there, the training for midwives is based there. But access from outside is very problematic. There's a reasonable road, say now from Bacau to Dili, and then down along the coast for about another 70 k's going towards Balabo, and then it becomes very rather. During the rain, the roads can be cut. It's an extremely hilly place, mountainous place, and getting around is mostly, particularly for the midwives and people working on the hill, is by motorbike. Because cars, four-wheel drives can get you there, but it's during the wet, moving around is very difficult. The other difficulty too is because there's a paucity of people working in the health centres, for them to come in for training to Dili is very difficult because A, there's the travelling time, leaving their families, but also there's nobody to relieve them in their health centres. So they leave, if they have to come in for 4 or 5 days, and it'll probably take at least a day to travel even from Bacau into Dili, then their own health services are denuded of any degree of professional help and obviously the family commitments. Now, just coming back, sorry, I thought it'd be light, and now I'll come back to death again. Just to contrast what are the principal causes of death in Australia, and this is from the latest report, 2008-2012. You can see most of the deaths in Australia are actually related to pre-existing heart disease. That's the big worry. Psychosocial, so now suicide, domestic violence is the next big one, which we're all well aware of now. Then we have obstetric hemorrhage, so bleeding basically from the birth canal, from the placenta or ruptured uteruses. Then other hemorrhage, maybe into the brain, it may be a rupture of a spleen or something like that. Infection is still a big factor, and then clots going off into the lung, thromboembolism, high blood pressure. The early pregnancy deaths, which are the ones that least ascertained, so either from miscarriage, very rare fortunately now from termination of pregnancy with a change in the law. That has certainly changed very rapidly once that happened, but ectopic pregnancies particularly, and that's I think where those figures for developing countries would not capture an ectopic pregnancy. Amniotic fluid embolism and the anaesthetists around here, anaesthetic-related deaths, and the other group. And what's driving the Australian one really is the increasing age. Women who in a generation ago wouldn't have got pregnant. IVF has driven quite a lot of that, and obesity. Obesity is a big factor now in maternal death, in child and neonatal death as well. A challenge. This is not for Timor, but this is the WHO from all causes, which is now really reflecting, as we've seen, most of the deaths are in developing countries. But again, so pre-existing conditions like the heart disease group that we were talking about earlier. Then there's from severe bleeding, mostly after the birth, but some of it before. The high blood pressure, where mostly the women die from the effect of high blood pressure, bursting blood vessels in the brain, or from affecting kidney. Complications of abortions, particularly in places like South America or places where termination of pregnancy is not legal, is still a big killer. So infection is also important. Obstructed labour, where where the woman's been labouring often in centres where there is no help and getting delay. So maybe the baby's lying crossways and can't come out. She's got a small pelvis, maybe a very large baby, maybe a baby with abnormalities. And then smaller but still important blood clots and embolism. So the contrast between the developing countries, Third World and Australia, is mostly it's the bleeding and high blood pressure and infections are the big cause problems. The UN, so WHO, UNFPA, UNICEF and World Bank have put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into improving training to reduce maternal mortality, which and this is the program that we've been basing our teaching on in Timor Leste. So it's in fact an extremely good book, which would do, although I actually edit a textbook, I keep it quiet because otherwise the students would go and buy this one, I think. It's a very good practical how to do it, which has been well done. So the topics that we do in the emergency obstetric training are obviously to do with obstetric emergencies, and as we've been looking at the big problem ones: bleeding after the baby's born, postpartum hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour, unexpected breech delivery, and where the shoulders get stuck, so the baby's head comes out, but the shoulders stop the baby getting out, which can either lead to getting it out successfully to affecting the nerve, so the arm, so-called Erb's palsy, paralysis of that, or in ones we can't get out, the baby will succumb. So it's teaching the healthcare providers, maternity care providers, how to deal with these emergencies. And then during the pregnancy, really the recognition of risk factors. Which ones should they try and get off to the bigger centres where there is specialist help? So in effect, people who've got known heart disease, people who've got known blood pressure, epilepsy, those sort of problems. Preventing anemia, making sure or trying to get the woman's hemoglobin up so if she does have a hemorrhage, she's in a much better position to cope with it, can sustain it. And then the other really important one is resuscitating the baby. Very basic steps will make a very big difference. Now, just coming back then to Timor Leste, so about 4 years ago, we set up a program which has been funded by the district, Rotary District of this area, District 9800, and Rotary International in Chicago. And I think the funding was about 120 million. I wish we were, what? 120,000, whoops, oh. That is certainly Freudian, that one. And what we did was we went up, a group of us, to talk with people in Timor-Leste. What could we do in a small way to try and help them reduce their maternal mortality, their neonatal mortality? And it became very obvious that, as I said earlier, there's good training in Dili, in the EMOC program run by UNFPA, but once they've had that, very few had refresher courses and had ongoing training. We focused initially at Bocau, up here. Bocau, as I mentioned earlier, is where the East Timor Roofing Company was. Bocau has the one large big airport, which was the UN base during the time of the Troubles, post-independence. And so because of our association with Bocau, we based our work initially there. We then ran a course out at Los Palos, which is up over the mountains. Another one down to Pekeki, where actually there were crocodiles in the river that we thought we might go swimming in. I think they'd come over from Darwin. And more recently, Likasa on the coast, Umira up in the mountains. Very lovely, quite cold, not enough, didn't really take enough warmth. And we're about to go in 3 weeks' time to Balibo, and Mariana. So I must say I'm looking forward to going to Balibo with. It's apparently got the best accommodation, although the accommodation and liquor on the beach was rather nice, intense. But you can see the size, and we're only just scratching the surface of it. So just to show you some of the team at work and what we do, it's very hands-on, very practical. So in this one, Caroline Homer, who's the Prof of Midwifery at UTS in Sydney and now the President of the College of Midwives, and Sue McDonald, who's also a Rotarian from North Balwyn, and Sue's Professor of Midwifery at La Trobe Mercy. We're incredibly lucky with the quality of the teachers we've got. What Caroline is doing here is the head is out, but the shoulders are stuck. So she's taking them through the manoeuvres of how you get the shoulders out and baby hopefully one piece. Here we've got Sue McDonald as the victim, Caroline, and we're going through a simulated collapse. What do you do if the woman collapses? It's about resuscitation, about oxygen, looking for what the cause of the bleeding is. And there's enormous enthusiasm when they get it up, but quite fun with it. So again, very practical. And this one, he's actually interesting. Alberto was the medical director at Bacal and was quite happy to come and go through this, which I thought was a very good sign. That the paediatrician there is Ingrid Busens. Ingrid is an Australian graduate, and her husband is Max Stahl, the photographer. Yes. Sandy Max has got throat cancer and is not at all well. But he went back to Timor Leste, and I started to tell you about the massacre where 50 were killed roughly at the time. And Max went back, had to change his name to go back. He was actually on Blue Peter before that, with a different surname. And he changed his name so he could get back into Timor Leste. This was during the Indonesian time. And he asked where one of the people who'd been beside him, who had a bayonet wound in his leg, was. And they said, we don't know. And then they started to ask more. So, in fact, the 200 who survived the initial attack were taken to the Indonesian military hospital. They were stoned. They were injected with formaldehyde. And the survivors were taken out into the bay and drowned. And they've since, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine and an Argentinian group of forensic pathologists who did a lot of work in the Balkans after the wars there, have helped trace, they've managed to uncover and identify quite a few of the victims from that. But anyhow, Ingrid is, because she speaks Tatum and Portuguese, has been a very, very good head. So here they're teaching the basic resuscitation of a baby, getting it. There's no point in teaching how to intubate a baby. There's no respirators there. That it just is not an ongoing solution. So it's a very practically directed. Doing breech deliveries, after doing 20 breech deliveries in a day, it is very tiring. I have great sympathy for my wife who had a breech delivery, yes. And so they're then being taught. The midwives often are quite experienced. It's the younger ones and the doctors who are the ones who need to be shown, if you're confronted with breech delivery, how do you get the baby out safely? Then we run a series of lectures and case studies. So this is just an example. For those of you who can't read Tatum, I was going to go down and say Tatum, but I can't remember what 20 is in Tatum. So but what we do is we set up a case study. So this is a 20-year-old in her first pregnancy. She's about 8 months pregnant, and she comes in for an antenatal check, and her blood pressure is quite elevated, 150 on 100. So we go through from there, well, what would you do? And so they discuss what investigations they would do, how they would examine. keeping it in a very practical way. And so they test the urine for protein, and they ask about other problems like headaches, pain in the centre of the stomach, which goes with high blood pressure, preeclampsia. Then they check, see how big the baby is, call for help, which is very important. Then the basic medications that they should give, blood pressure control, nifedipine or Aldomet with Aldoba. The frustrating thing, though, is with this, in fact, I'll come back in a moment. And the next day, blood pressure now is really high. She's in a real danger, this woman, with headache, heavy protein in urine, what do you do? And then she has a seizure. So we go through what sort of treatment to use, and then about how to deliver the baby and get on. The thing that is, I think, frustrating for all concerned, particularly those working up there, is the availability of drugs and basic equipment. For example, when we were at Vakeki, we were saying, okay, if the woman bleeds very heavily, yes, you haven't got blood here, but you get them over the mountain to Pacau. It's about an hour and a half away. When you get to Pacau, they'll be able to get blood transfusion, and they'll have the particular antibiotics you need. When we went back to Pacau, no blood transfusion, no IV lines. They had a few catheters. They'd run out of antibiotics. And this is the second major hospital. And where was it? It was all down in Dili. And my explanation to that is I'm saying they lost 250,000 of that group. That's that middle management group that you would expect to run your hospital and your services are just not there. And it's coming, it's building up, but that's the resources. And also there are so many NGOs up there that are working across purposes at times. The coordination issue is a big one. And that's one of our group. What we do is we run 2 two-day workshops going through all those things that we've looked at, and what is very important in the end is the certificate. And so we do 2 lots of those for 2 days. And the question that Keith was asking, can we show that we've made a difference? We've got anecdotal, but it would be very difficult to objectively show that. But certainly the anecdotal, for example, Carl would have been 3 times reporting that they no longer have to have a doctor go to a caesarean section to resuscitate the baby. The midwives now are very good at it. Recently Arturo, which is the island just off Dili, they did their first 2-day teaching, and that night the person had in fact a major bleed. The person had resuscitated and got the person over to Dili the next day and said it hadn't been taught by that group, the team, the woman wouldn't survive. So we've got anecdotal, but it would be very difficult to show, I think, a dramatic increase in maternal mortality and claim really to say that it really was us doing it. So, I say a beautiful place that's looking out from Likasar across the coast. Indonesia's in the distance, sunset. That's up at Pacau, just down on the coast. Yes, and Pacau's about 500, about 300 metres elevation. So it's rather nice in the evening, it's cool. And that was the Portuguese port and capital. The tourist potential for Timor Leste is enormous. Once they get good communication trouble. At least now there is electricity, it's pretty reliable. The Chinese have put electricity in. There's obviously major corruption went on. Apparently the Japanese, with the road that was meant to be built from Dili to Pacau, and the money disappeared from that. But there is, aid money is helping, and of course they do have income coming from the oil and gas, which is going into a development fund. So there, although things at times are frustratingly poor, there I think it is positive hope. So the challenges, we have communication with the health department and health centres. Sounds like Australia actually. Sorry, it's a bit unfair as I am seconded to the health department here at times. I had that naive, we would do one see one, teach one, that we would go up there, run a course, we'd have the East Timor Leste health providers, midwife doctors, and they would be able to then start teaching and taking. We've identified some very good people and some good teaching. Our problem is we're being asked to go to different places and they can't get released. So we've just been refunded to do another. We've done 8 trips from funds for 5, so we're fairly frugal. And we're hoping to make it now much more sustainable because it has to be sustainable, this training. We expect our maternity service providers in Australia to go through these courses every year and more complex parts of it as well. But these people who are out in they really need to have it reinforced like any good teaching principle. Meeting the demand for the courses, and that's where the 1.1 million would be nice.
No, 120.
120 million, sorry, yes, thanks, I'll take a check. There's also wide variation in experience. The midwives in general are very experienced and very good, and it's really reassuring to see the young doctors recognising that and don't have an ego about it. Then there are the young ones. The ones who've been trained, as I mentioned, in Cuba, they probably have good theoretical training, but they most of them see very few patients. So they've had very little practical experience. And that's certainly, when I was more actively involved in training medical students, we used to have a lot coming out from Italy and Germany, the same thing. Anybody could go to a medical school, but they wouldn't get patient contact. So that's quite a challenge, is getting them up to scratch. Because you can imagine what it's like 2 or 3 hours away from anywhere and you've got a dying patient, what it must be like to deal with, particularly as a young doctor. I'm in awe of what they achieve. The other is the depth of underlying knowledge, stuff that we take for granted, about understanding the basic physiology and pathology. You scratch underneath that and it's not there. So it has to be very practical training. You can't say, well, why do you do this? And many don't. Particularly those who came through the Indonesian was very much rote. There's a dance they do of the 20, I think it's 23 things for a delivery. It's quite entertaining, but you ask, why do you do that? Well, it has to go through in that order. And that is Indonesian teaching. And I think, and Southeast Asian as well. Languages, I mentioned before, is a major problem because of the different languages. And access, as I mentioned earlier too, for the attendees. That's what it's about. They're lovely people, very generous, very lovely to work with, and it's been a real privilege. And I must say I'm looking forward to going back to Timor Leste in a few weeks. Thank you.